At least 33 individuals were reported to have lost their lives in an airstrike conducted on a village in Nigeria's northwestern Zamfara state last week. This after a military operation aimed to flush armed kidnapping gangs and their hideouts. The incident on the 10th of April adds to a series of lethal aerial attacks carried out by the military, resulting in the deaths of innocent civilians. Let's now unpack this with Professor Christopher Isike from the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria. Prof, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening. Now, Prof, what do you think is known about the context and the circumstances surrounding this airstrike by the Nigerian military? Was there another intended target as opposed to what we already know?
Yeah, there was an intended target, which is, the criminal gangs that are commonly referred to as bandits that terrorize the area. Some of them have links to Boko Haram as well. Those were supposed to be the intended target, but I think that from the report so far, it appears it's another case of faulty intelligence, and I say another case because this is not new. The military, over the last 5 years, has been involved in these kinds of killings. In some instances, the military itself has actually accepted culpability, but nothing has been said of this one so far.
And I mean, that was my next question in terms of how the Nigerian government as well as the military has responded to this incident and the allegations that civilians were killed.
Well, their response is usually mute in the initial stages, and then under the previous government, for example, there is usually no follow-up, no instruction for even an investigation by the president. In this case, this president has done well to always push his, military commanders to inquire, investigate, and give a report. This is what they did in the last instance a couple of months ago. So we hope that the military would oblige and do right by not just the government, but also the people who are aggrieved by these killings.
And a little later, I want us, Prof, just to touch on what impact that has on the relationship between the government and the people of Nigeria when you say they are mute in the initial stages. But what is the international community's reaction to this airstrike and the reported civilian casualties? How is it being viewed from a humanitarian perspective as well as from a human rights point?
Well, it's condemnation. It's always been the case, especially from the United States, where which has been, helping the military, not just in training, but also in selling, these aircrafts and other ammunition to help fight, Boko Haram terrorism in the northeast and northwest part of Nigeria. So they've condemned it. You see usually senators or House of Representative members of Congress coming out to speak against this, calling for investigations and even sometimes reviewing future requests or support for the military. So these have not gone down well with the international community, of course, not talk less of the citizens themselves in the country that also seem to have the disconnection between themselves and the military, which also has a history of terrorizing people that it is supposed to be protecting.
There have been attempts in terms of integrating former Boko Haram members within Cameroon. Has there been such an integration within Nigeria? And are there any links with regards to some of these groups still continuing with some of these insurgencies and there being a failure in terms of that integration within the communities?
Yeah, that's correct. Under the previous government, many of them who were captured were released and then integrated into the army. Apart from that, you've also had cases of, some army commanders, spokespersons themselves acknowledging that the military has been infiltrated by Boko Haram. So there are these infiltrations into the military that generally tend to compromise its effectiveness in handling the issue of terrorism and banditry and just sometimes crass criminality, which they are not able to deal with because of these kinds of compromises from within. And just recently, I was reading about 200 people that were previously arrested by the military and investigated, and they given a clean bill of health and reintegrated. I'm not saying that is not the case, but oftentimes you find out that it's the same people who eventually engage in indiscriminate killings after being released. There was a case of someone who was released, integrated into the army, and then used the military facilities and amenities to perpetrate horrendous acts. So these issues are there, and it speaks to the larger challenge of the politicization of the army, in the country.
So with that said, Prof, in your expert opinion, what are the potential political and security implications of this incident within Nigeria and the broader region?
Well, it basically tends to further alienate citizens from the states. There is a very serious national question challenge in the country already, and this is not just in Nigeria, it's Africa as a whole, given the way these contraptions called states were formed without citizens' consent in many instances. And as a result, some of us have said that there are no social contracts between government and states and citizens in much of Africa. And so that's a perennial challenge in the country. But then even within the region itself, Nigeria's inability or weaknesses in dealing with the Boko Haram terrorism, especially in terms of how they've handled many of the operations that they've engaged in, speaks to its ability as a regional leader, to stand on the credential of a regional leader and even a giant of Africa status that it is always pursuing, given its Afrocentric foreign policy. So these definitely challenge the state from within and outside the state, and it is something that needs to be fixed if Nigeria is to take its proper place in the Committee of Nations, at least within Africa and the rest of the world.
Speaking of challenges, Prof, what dilemmas do militaries have in trying to combat insurgencies and terrorism while avoiding civilian harm? What lessons can be learned here?
Well, we need to improve civil military relations, the relations between the military and civil society and citizens. There needs to be proper orientation of what their roles are and the role that citizens also can play in securing themselves. It also speaks to the need for security sector reform in the country. But fundamental to all of this is also trying to fix the question of the perverse state that continues to see itself as a master, over citizens rather than it's being a conduit for developing people. So these kinds of misconceptions about the role of the state and leadership, not just in Nigeria but across the continent, are important issues to fix, and they're fundamental to issues of corruption, issues of citizen apathy in the political system, and all kinds of challenges that have to do with nation building.
You spoke earlier on, Prof, that the government remains mute in the initial stages, tries to investigate and gather as much intel as possible. How might this incident impact relations between the Nigerian government and local communities, as well as with the country's international standing?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, that it doesn't help the situation, doesn't help the relations between citizens, local communities and the state, because in the first instance there's a lot of mistrust between citizens and the military, given how they've conducted themselves in the past and their role in sometimes even perpetuating some of the conflicts that we see, especially when you look at it from the angle of the military being infiltrated by Boko Haram and other terrorist groups in that part of the country. So these kinds of inefficiencies and the lukewarm nature of government towards attacks like this tend to further alienate the citizens from government, and that's not good for nation building. And within the continent also, it compromises Nigeria's ability, to play its role as a so-called regional leader, at least in the West African sub-region, and also in the continent at large.
I mean, what really needs to be done, Prof, in order to do away with these insurgencies? I mean, the issue with the Boko Haram has gone on for many years. We know with the Bring Back Our Girls, the Chibok girls that were held captive over so many years ago, the recent incidents that we've also seen of the school children that have been abducted. What do you truly believe needs to happen in Nigeria between the military, the communities themselves, and the government in order to bring a halt to this culture?
Oh, well, the problem of terrorism and Boko Haram in Nigeria is hydra-headed. There are several factors that are causal to this challenge. But fundamental to it is the the question of social injustice. That citizens feel aggrieved about how government tend to see them and relate with them. The neglect and marginalization of certain groups within the country that give rise to the politicization of ethnicity and the ethnicization of politics, and all of these play a role. But you also want to add the deprivations, the social and economic deprivations that many people suffer that make them vulnerable to exploitation and listening to the messages of terrorists, and beginning to feel that the terrorists sometimes even respond and see them better than their own states, local government. So the question of good governance is central, but also, like I said before, it's high time that Nigeria begins to really look at the question of having a new social contract, a new kind of compact between state and citizens that will clearly outline, belonging to the state, that will clearly outline the parameters for rule of law that everyone will be subject to, and then from that kind of social contract and what it will mean for those that will govern. Governing well, fairly rooted in the principle of social justice and equality of citizenship for all, will follow and become a backbone of preventing conflict and also resolving them when they do occur, because conflict is not unnatural in a state where you have multiple identities, whether it be based on religion or culture or ethnicity or even ideology, as the case may be. So fixing the problem of the state, having a new social contract, and governing well based on rule of law and equality of citizenship would help to alleviate some of these problems and prevent. Get communities to be involved in helping police and the military, if necessary, to fight the scourge if it persists. But the issue is that citizens themselves have a role to play. But right now there's an alienation between state and citizen, which does not allow citizens to come out and play the roles that they're supposed to play. So for me, that citizenship question, social contract question, good governance questions, all of these need to be addressed to solve this problem, ultimately, not just at the peripheral level.
Most certainly many factors that need to be considered there. Thank you so much for your time, Prof, and for giving us those insights. That's Professor Christopher Isike from the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria.